from Mr. John Landry, a docent at the USS Midway Museum. Most of you already are well familiar with the Naval Order. If you're not, I invite you to either visit the website at the link shown below on the streamer, or simply go into your search browser and type in Naval Order of the United States or Continental Commandary Naval Order of the United States, and you will find either the primary website of the Naval Order or our Continental Commandary's website. At that time, you can click links from one to reach the other. Today's speaker, John Landry, was born and raised in Detroit, Michigan. He attended Notre Dame University in South Bend, Indiana, where he earned his Bachelor of Architecture degree in 1961, following which he attended Officer Candidate School in Newport, Rhode Island. And he received his commission in 1962 and first served as the ASW Division Officer aboard the USS Wren DD 586, homeported in Norfolk, and subsequently as the ASW Nuclear Weapons ASROC Division Officer aboard the USS Tatnall DD 19, homeported out of Charleston. He left active duty in 1965, whereupon he joined the Naval Reserve as a member of the submarine squadron that drilled out of Detroit, Michigan. John's career has been as an architect. He retired in 2005. Then in 2013, he became a volunteer docent at the USS Midway Museum. Today, John's going to talk about how the USS Midway went from an active aircraft carrier, about which we heard some during our July lecture, and how it became one of the most popular museums in the United States. Without further ado, I turn the program over to you, John.
Thank you, Fred. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the USS Midway presentation of the Midway Story. You're seeing the ship as it's moored in San Diego now as a museum at Navy Pier. Next. And this is an overview of the Midway Museum tied up in the Navy Pier, as you can see, right adjacent to downtown San Diego. Next. So the Midway Story is the story of a ship that was in service of the United States for 47 years between 1945 and 1991. The Midway was commissioned on 10 September of 1945, just 8 days after the surrender of Japan in Tokyo Bay on 8 September of 1945. The Midway is the longest serving aircraft carrier in the U.S. Navy. It is, when the Midway started its journey in 1945, it was the largest ship in the world. It was also the first carrier to have a steel deck. And the Midway saw 3 home ports. First one in Norfolk, Virginia between 1945 and 1954. The second home port was in Alameda, California in between 1958 and 1973. And then Yokosuka, Japan in 1973 through 1991. In this presentation, you will see a ship that sailed the oceans of the world. The Atlantic Ocean, the Pacific, the Mediterranean Sea, the Labrador Sea, the North Sea, the Aegean Sea, and the Arabian Gulf. The Midway deployed to Vietnam 3 times between 1965 and 1973. And in 1991, Midway fought in Desert Storm, flying combat sorties, and was the tactical command ship of all U.S. Navy forces in that area. And the Midway also conducted humanitarian evacuations, which were part of its mission. the evacuation of Quemoy Mansu crisis, the evacuation of the end of the Vietnamese War, and the evacuation of military personnel after the eruption of Mount Pinatubo in the Philippines. Next. Next. As you can see, the Midway is actually the story of three lives. One on active duty, the next its life in the boneyard and its trip to San Diego, and then finally today its life at the USS Midway Museum. Next. The Midway was named in honor of the Battle of Midway. Next. And as you can see, I'm showing here the famous SBD Devastator dive bombers that participated in the Battle of Midway on 4 June 1942. Next. This is a Navy torpedo plane coming in to attack a Japanese carrier. Next. And the torpedo bomber has launched its fish in this case. Next. So first part of this presentation will be of the active duty service between 1945 and 1991. Next. As you can see, the ship was launched in 1945 from the Naval Shipyard in Newport News, Virginia. Next. Its first commander was Captain Joseph Bolger. Next. And the Midway was the first of a class of Midway carriers, of which there were three. Next. Of course, the Midway was the lead carrier of the group. The second carrier is the Roosevelt CV-42. It was commissioned in October of 1945. And then comes the Coral Sea CV-43, which was commissioned in October of 1947. Truly, the Midway was an engineering marvel, which was constructed between 1943 and 1945. It was the first Navy ship to be too large to pass through the Panama Canal. It was 4 years in design, and believe it or not, there were 90 tons of blueprints to put this ship together. Took a year and a half to build. Displaced 45,000 tons, and it's the first carrier to have a steel flight deck. Next. This is a picture of the build process, 1944 through 1945.
John, just note, you seem to be moving, shuffling papers, and we're hearing a lot of background noise, so be mindful of that.
Okay, thank you. So this next slide is a picture of the Midway under construction, but this happens to be the hangar deck level. Then over the course of the life of the Midway, there were flight deck changes from a straight deck in 1945 to a change in 1957 to a 9-degree angle deck, and then in 1970, a 13-degree angle deck. As you can see here, straight deck on the left, and then in 1987, a picture of the 13-degree angle deck of the carrier. This illustrates the straight deck for the carrier in 1945, but the number one challenge for straight deck landings was to avoid hitting any aircraft that were parked up in the catapult area beyond the arresting cables. So the solution to this was to provide multiple arresting cables, which you can see in this illustration. And in the case of the Midway, there were 14 different arresting cables prior to the catapult area. Next. And this is just another picture of the straight deck. And another one with the ship underway. And in this case, loaded with aircraft. And the top view of what the straight deck carrier looked like. So in March of 1946, the Midway participated in Operation Frostbite in subarctic cold weather conditions in the Labrador Sea. The main purpose of this operation was to see if they could function with their aircraft, specifically the Ryan FR Fireball, and to test out helicopter rescue techniques in cold weather. This illustrates their position in the Labrador Sea, sandwiched between Greenland and Newfoundland. This is the aircraft they were testing, the Ryan Fireball RF. And as you can see, it was quite a challenge. They had snow on the flight deck, and you can see the Ryan Fireball aircraft parked at the stern of the ship. And you can see the magnitude of the challenge here with the snow. And again, the challenge of keeping their aircraft operational. And then we get to the family pictures. In this case, the family had a potential weapon at hand. And you'll see in the next picture, and as is the case with most families, the weapon at hand and the fight began. And this is a picture of trying to maintain the condition of the aircraft to be flight worthy in subarctic conditions. And then in March of 1947, the Midway participated in Operation Sandy. And that actually is the dawn of the U.S. Navy missile program. And it occurred about 200 miles south of Bermuda. And this is a picture of the V-2 rocket, the captured V-2 rocket that was part of this test, which was to test whether or not a missile could be launched from the flight deck of the USS Midway. And the fact that Midway had a 3-inch steel flight deck made this test feasible. And here you can see the actual launch of the V-2 missile off the stern of the carrier. And two more pictures of the actual launch itself. And then finally, when the rocket reached about 15,000 feet, it broke up and came back in pieces into the Atlantic Ocean. And then in October of 1947, the Midway made its first deployment to the Med 6th Fleet. And then in February of 1948, in heavy seas, unfortunately, a Liberty launch capsized and we lost 8 sailors to that accident. And this happened just off the coast of Toulon, France, in the Mediterranean. This is a picture of a tragedy aboard the Midway, a landing of an F-9F Panther, producing fire on the flight deck, and it killed the pilot. Then the Midway participated in Operation Mainbrace, which turns out to be a very pivotal operation to the future of all U.S. aircraft carriers. In this operation, it was a NATO operation, and the U.S. had noticed that the HMS Triumph for the British had made successful angle deck attempts, and so the Midway actually drew an angled deck or painted an angled deck on its flight deck and conducted several touch and go landings. And it turned out to be a success and led to widespread adoption of the angled deck. And you might ask, well, what is the significant advantage of, could we go back to the last, yeah, what is the significant advantage? Well, actually proceed forward. One more. I'm sorry, go back. One more. So you might ask the significant advantage of an angle deck. Well, its biggest advantage is the ability to be able to recover high-speed jet aircraft. The angle deck provided three options. If the pilot missed the cable coming in at 150, 160 miles an hour, they could do a touch and go without hitting any other aircraft on the carrier. Secondly, if the pilot caught an arresting cable and the cable broke, it allowed for a touch and go. And then finally, should it happen, if the pilot's hook broke, it could also the pilot could also touch and go and make a barrier landing. Next slide, please. Next. Then in 1954, in the Mediterranean under heavy seas, under a underway replenishment, the Midway collided with the supply ship USS Great Sitkin. Next. This is a ship of the, this is a picture of the Sitkin, excuse me, the Sitkin. And as you can see, we have the replenishment underway in very close quarters between the Midway, the supply ship, and a destroyer outboard. Then upon breakaway, both the Sitkin and the Midway collided. In the case of the Midway, it would be the starboard quarter, seriously damaging one of their 5-inch guns. And then on the Sitkin, some minor damage to their port quarter. Then 27 December 54, the the Midway sailed from Norfolk to Taiwan and participated in the Quemoy-Matsu crisis, which is dubbed in our naval terms, where it was participating in potentially the first nuclear crisis, because this was called the Second Taiwan Straits Crisis between China and nationalist China. And China was shelling the shores between mainland China and two islands off the coast near the Takan Islands. And this was a test by the Chinese mainland to see just how far the U.S. would go to defend nationalist China. And in actuality, the United States put an attack with nuclear weapons on the table during this crisis. The Midway flew air cover for the battle between the nationalist forces and mainland China, and eventually evacuated 15,000 Chinese nationalist troops and 20,000 Chinese civilians. Then in 1955, the Midway went back to Seattle for a 2-year shipyard overhaul and extensive modernization, where the Midway received its first angle deck, which was a 9-degree deck. It's a picture of the shipyard in Puget Sound. And after 2 years, we see next, we see a modification that shows the angle deck. In this case, we now see 2 outboard elevators, and we see 3 catapults, 2 forward and 1 on the angle deck. And then forward, we're seeing 2 jet blast screens up in the forward area of the launch area of the ship. Next. And this is a picture of the 9-degree angle deck of the carrier. And another picture of the same configuration. Then the USS Midway participated in the first autopilot landing on a carrier with hands-off of both the controls and the throttle. The landing was made from controls operated by equipment on the USS Midway off the coast of California, and this was a result of 16 years research by the Navy to accomplish this feat. F-4A Phantom was the first aircraft to land in a hands-off condition by Lieutenant Commander Randall Billings. And the second aircraft was an F-8D Crusader piloted by Lieutenant Commander Robert Chu. In April of '65, the Midway deployed to Vietnam, striking military and logistics targets in both North and South Vietnam. And then on 17 June of '65, the Midway gets its first kill of a Russian MiG fighter. 2 F-4 Phantoms took out 2 MiG fighters. And then, oddly enough, we have a prop Navy A-1 Skyraider downing, actually 3 of them, downing 2 Russian MiGs. And it turns out the 3 Skyraiders are launched on a rescue mission to find a F-105 pilot who was downed over Vietnam. The rescue pilots were Lieutenant Commander Greathouse, Lieutenant J.G. Lynn, and Lieutenant Johnson. All these pilots then, when they were airborne and over Vietnam, were notified by a Navy destroyer there was incoming unidentified aircraft approaching, what turned out to be 2 Russian MiGs. And the MiGs started the engagement by firing rockets at the A-1 Skyraiders, who then immediately dove to 500 feet and traveled close to the ground in deep valley territory of Vietnam. And these A-1 Skyraiders turned inside the MiGs, and eventually they finally were able to make a turn on both MiGs and down 2 MiGs with 3 A-1 Skyraiders. In 1966, the Midway returned to San Francisco for another massive modernization, which took 4 years to complete. In 1970, the modifications were complete. They had a new angle deck at 13 degrees. The flight deck was increased to 4 acres. The elevators were enlarged and they increased their capacity 2 times. The more sophisticated steam catapults were installed, and a program ballooned from an $80 million modification to $200 million. And in 31 January 1970, Midway turned to active duty. And unfortunately, all of the modifications that were made in San Francisco worsened the seakeeping ability of the Midway in rough seas. Next. This is a picture of the Midway as it's configured in 1970 and today as a museum with the 13-degree angle deck. Then in May of 1971, the Midway deployed back to Vietnam to strike targets on both North and South Vietnam. Then in October of 71, it returned back to its base in Alameda, California. And a short time later, in 1972, they were redeployed back to Vietnam, again striking targets off of Yankee Station in both North and South Vietnam. And then after that deployment in Vietnam, the USS Midway proceeds to a new home port in Yokosuka, Japan. And Yokosuka Naval Base is located just south of Tokyo. And I might add, home porting in Yokosuka was the first time a U.S. Navy aircraft carrier was ever home ported outside the United States. Then in April of 1975, the Midway conducted a rescue operations in Operation Frequent Wind and rescued various Vietnamese from Saigon and South Vietnam. And during that rescue operation, we had a very unusual landing on the ship. There was a Lieutenant Buang of the Vietnamese Air Force who was trying to escape Vietnam and loaded his family, his wife and 5 children, onto a single-engine VNAT-01 aircraft and flew out to sea to find a rescue. He was dangerously low on fuel, but he did find the Midway and circled the Midway, trying to make contact with the ship, but to no avail. He resorted to writing a note, which he attached to his pistol, flew low over the Midway, and dropped that note on the flight deck. The Midway Captain Chambers read the note and ordered the crew to push a number of planes overboard to make room for the Vietnamese pilot to land. And sure enough, he made a very dangerous landing on the Midway. And of course, the crew went wild, knowing the situation under which he landed. And eventually, the crew members of the Midway subsequently campaigned to collect money so that the family could immigrate to the United States, which they did. Next. Now, 1979, the Midway was dealing with all these Cold War calculations and Russian taunts. And as you can see from this photograph, we see a Russian bear doing a flyover, probably no more than 300-400 feet above the Midway. Then in July of 1980, the Midway has a collision with the freighter Cactus. And this occurs just in the Singapore Straits in Asia. And you can see here just south of Singapore itself. And the merchant ship Cactus sustained damage in its bow, and it ripped the port side of the Midway with its bow, and you will see here in a minute. It was loaded with lumber, and you can see this is the port side of the Midway taking out some of the aircraft up on the flight deck. The damage is clearly visible here. And then, unfortunately, 2 sailors were killed when the bow did rip through the hangar deck area of the ship. In 1986, to address the seakeeping issues that persisted with the USS Midway, blisters were added to improve the heavy sea performance. This was a $138 million retrofit, but actually the blisters added to the problem. And in October of 1988, in a typhoon in the Japan Sea, fortunately, USS Midway survived a 26-degree roll to then forever be known as the rock and roll carrier, as you will see in this photograph. The ship is taking in excess of a 26-degree roll, and fortunately, it didn't continue its roll. And in 1986, the F-4 Phantom was replaced by the FAA-19 Hornet on the ship. And then in 1990, in Operation Desert Storm, USS Midway participated. And the ship ran some 228 sorties from the Midway in support of Operation Desert Storm. The Midway itself was part of Battle Force Zulu and was the tactical command carrier in Battle Force Zulu, comprised of the Midway, the Ranger CV-61, the USS America CV-66, and then the US Roosevelt CVN-71, which we'll see in this formation of 4 carriers, a rare sight indeed, at the USS Midway in the upper left portion of this picture. And then finally, the USS Midway conducted an evacuation operation, Operation Fiery Vigil, when Mount Pinatubo of the Philippines, just north of Manila, erupted. It was a major eruption, and I don't think I'd want to be the person driving this truck trying to get away from a fiery ash coming at you at 200 miles an hour. The U.S. Midway evacuated Clark Air Force Base and evacuated its Navy base at Subic Bay, all told evacuating some 20,000 people. And then in August of 1991 was the last cruise. Midway departs Yokosuka Navy Base for Pearl Harbor, and comes in an iconic photograph of the Midway leaving and giving its sayonara goodbye with all of the ship's crew in dress whites. And then 23 August of 1991, there was a change of command in Pearl Harbor between U.S. Independence and the Midway. Bravo Zulu, USS Midway, on its active duty of 47 years for the United States of America. Next. This is a picture of the Midway with its 13-degree angle deck, the crew in dress whites. Now, next, please. Now, there is an 11-year life from the Navy Boneyard. Next. Midway was decommissioned on 11 April at North Island Navy Station in San Diego. And they give their last salute to the ship. And it rested at the Boneyard in Bremerton, Washington, at the U.S. Navy base. Then there was an 11-year trek to get it down to the museum. It took some $5 million. The Navy was less than unanimous in its support for the concept of bringing the ship to San Diego to be a museum. And next. Now the life as a museum in San Diego begins. Next. On 10 January of 2004, the ship is towed and put into place at Navy Pier in San Diego. As you can see, it's nestled in to its pier in downtown. And it holds its sway next to Navy Pier. There'll be a series of slides here if you'd go through them, please. And anybody who's walking the boardwalk can see it. Now, the question for everyone is, do you know that the Midway was also involved in the unconditional surrender? Next. Everybody recognizes this photograph in 1945 after the end of World War II. But next to the Midway is a piece of sculpture which is called Unconditional Surrender. And anyone who visits the USS Midway can see this apropos sculpture in the park right adjacent to the Midway. Next. And this is the Midway as a museum. There are more than 800 volunteers at the museum. It has become a world-renowned museum. And the TripAdvisor has named the USS Midway Museum as the number 5 museum in all of the United States. And in 2000, as you can see, the attendance has been increasing every year. In 2018, we had 1.3 million visitors on the ship. We also, the Midway Museum conducts active duty military services, change of command ceremonies, weddings, funerals. Also, the Midway is host to corporate events scheduled from time to time. And we also had a basketball game on the Midway flight deck between Michigan State and North Carolina. And the Midway is host to students in San Diego County, and every year they conduct a science program for 30,000 students in the San Diego area. And if you visit the Midway, you can get your picture taken and go home with the catapult shooter in the picture with you. Thank you very much. You are cordially invited to tour the USS Midway at any time.
Thank you, John. It was a fascinating history of the Midway, both during its years of active duty and as a museum ship. One of the things that came to mind as you were speaking about the missile test, how do they launch a missile off of the flight deck without causing substantial damage to the deck, or was it we launch and then we resurface the deck?
Well, they probably resurfaced it, but remember, we're dealing with 3 inches of solid steel. So I really I don't know for sure, but I haven't read anything that said that there was major damage.
I mean, as an ASW officer, I'm sure you got used to having to repaint the launchers each time you'd fire an ASROC.
Absolutely.
The bulletins always loved you for it, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Let's see. Another question is, how frequently did she need to replenish when she was at sea during deployment?
On average, about every 3 or 4 days.
Oh, as a tin can sailor, I remember pulling alongside and taking a drink, but recognized that as much as we depended on carriers as well as AOs for our fuel, they didn't have unlimited supplies either.
Well, so also to give you a feel for it, remember the USS Midway, when it was underway, was serving 13,000 meals per day.
That's amazing. What was her crew size? I know typically we have about 5,000 on somebody like the Carl Vinson. Were the crews larger back then or smaller?
Midway had about 4,500 crew.
Okay, so nearly. And did that include the air wing, or was that ship's company?
That's ship's company.
Okay, so with the air wing, we're still getting close to about 5,000.
I think so.
Excellent. Let's see if there are any other questions coming in. I don't see any other questions. What's going to happen next is we will post this broadcast. I'll share the link with you so you can share it with members of the museum family and friends. I put it on the museum website. I'll also have it on the Continental Commandary's website, and I will post a link to it at our Continental Commandary's LinkedIn affinity group as well. So folks will be able to watch it, rewatch it, and also, of course, share it with those who weren't able to join us today. With that, I want to thank you. I want to thank the folks who logged in to watch, and I know a lot of members will watch it in their own time at 4:30 in the afternoon. For those of us on the East Coast, a lot of folks are still at work, and same thing as we go further west. But really appreciate your contribution today and your being with us, and you're working through all of our, again, we continue to be on the learning curve in terms of the technical challenges, but we adapted, we improvised, and we overcame. So truly appreciate that. I'm going to go ahead